So we're going to talk today about developing countries, and that's actually just a broad name for what we're going to talk about is actually the countries that we have that form sort of as a result of World War II and sort of were kind of in the process of forming before World War II. But we're just going to kind of bounce around and check in with everybody because all of these, we're going to start interacting these countries together. So what I'd like to do for this week is to kind of examine how all these countries got positioned, and then next week we can talk about the effect of globalization and pluralization and what it means that all these countries are trying to interact with each other. And that won't be so chronologically historical. It'll be more like, let's talk about the trends and how they affect everything. So that'll be what we do next week. So let's just figure out kind of where we left everything. The end of World War II causes this sort of massive shakeup of the governments of the world. And sometimes that means that a country disappears completely, and sometimes that means that a country formed out of sort of the ether of World War II. There were economies that existed before World War II that were very strong, and World War II caused them to collapse. And then there were economies that were very weak and suddenly were positioned to be very strong. So let's talk about some examples. Let's start with Japan, because Japan by far is one of my favorites. Okay, so I want y'all to think about the Tokugawa seclusion and how Japan came out of that, how they managed to emerge on fairly stable footing and competitive with other empires, where China was basically run over by all of the European forces. Do y'all remember some of the things that they did in order to ensure their own sovereignty? What were some of the things that Japan did in order to make sure that they were going to stay in charge of their own destiny?
They blocked off the borders.
Yeah, okay, I got two. I got one on Zoom and one in the class. They closed themselves off. What did that mean from an economic standpoint for like buying and selling products? If you were living in Japan during that time.
It means they had to manufacture everything themselves, anything that they needed. But it also means that they kind of got a little left behind in terms of like technology around the world.
Right. So what happened in the 10 years after the Tokugawa seclusion, after Matthew Perry got there? What happened to them that put them on solid footing? Does anybody remember?
Yeah, they become westernized. Yeah,
they went out in search of the things that would make them more hi Lisa. In search of the things that would make them more still maintain their own sovereignty. They had very, very strong tariffs on products coming in, and reached out to try to put their products out as much as possible. So after World War II, Germany was occupied, and it was split up between the Allied powers so that it was like broken into quarters. Y'all remember that? Japan was also occupied, but it wasn't broken apart because the Emperor of Japan negotiated his surrender, the surrender of his country with that in mind, and said that they would only surrender if they were able to maintain a whole and not be broken up and put under the supervision of different Allied powers. So Japan was able to maintain basically its wholeness, even though it had to recover from some pretty drastic things, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Immediately between 1945 and 1955, they formed a ministry specifically to address how they're going to exist in this world post-World War II. And the way that they did it was by reestablishing and strengthening their relationship with Bushido. They brought that I don't know, filial structure, that patriarchal structure back and put it into their business world. And so like right now, if you go to Japan, or especially, well, I don't know about right now, but right after this and up into like the 80s and 90s, if you went into Japan and wanted to buy an apple, the apple would cost you $8 or $9.
Wow.
Because they don't grow apples in Japan, okay? So they discourage their own citizens from purchasing other countries' goods.
Okay.
And then they put Japanese products in as many countries as possible. And if there's something they can't produce, then they find out where it can be produced and buy that land and produce it there. So basically, what you end up with are all of these great big families that are connected to each other. I'm sorry, a hawk just flew right past that window and like parked and waved and then went back. I was like, hi. Anyway, these families that built every piece of an industry and then supported each other through those industries. So between 1945 and 1955, Japan basically rebuilt itself. Because it was occupied by American troops, it was never under any threat of being moved in on by the Soviet Union, and they were able to establish a strong trade relationship with all of those Western countries, with Britain, with the US, with France. And as a result, Japan rose up as one of the strongest economies after World War II. So that's cool. So that's where we're going to leave Japan.
Hey, Mindy,
Yes.
did the Marshall Plan embrace Japan, or was that just Europe?
Oh no, the Marshall Plan helped Japan. Everywhere that American troops were allowed to occupy, financial help was poured into any area that in order to support it. It wasn't the same kind of financial support that like Germany got and France got and Britain got, but it was still financial support. But the biggest thing I think that the Americans gave the Japanese was trade relationships, the ability to come into America and establish industries in America. So like in 1945, Japan is like hanging on to its economy by its fingernails. By 1955, people are starting to think about possibly putting Sony products in their house.
Question, top picture is after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah.
The bottom was 10 years after the U.S. rebuilt it.
The US didn't rebuild it, Japan rebuilt it.
Oh, they did?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yep. That's probably not the same street view.
Right.
This is Hiroshima, this is probably Tokyo. So, but yeah,
Say, Mindy,
yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong, but at least 20 other major cities in Japan were as bad as the nuked cities as anything else. I mean, they had firebombed most of the country.
Yeah, that's true. They had taken major damage in most of their urban centers, but those were like the Blitz in London. They had you know.
Yeah, they're conventional bombing.
Right. So it's a slightly different. I guess it's a slightly different kind of morale damage. That feels more like collateral damage when your cities get bombed when you're in the middle of a war.
Mm-hmm.
But Hiroshima and Nagasaki were like. I don't know. Anyway, okay, so let's check in with a couple of other countries. Let's talk about India. Now, India has been subservient to Britain this whole for a long time. India was the East India Company started moving into Britain in the 1600s and the 1700s. They got really powerful and started parking their own like private mercenary military in India. In 1850s, the Indians began to rebel against the East India Company. And since the East India Company was kind of folding under its own weight anyway, some of those rebellions were actually kind of successful. In 1876, Queen Victoria was named Empress of India as a way of strengthening Britain's hold over India. They appointed local Maharajas amongst the Indian people, but they named Victoria as their empress, even though she never went there.
Queen Elizabeth's mother.
Oh no, they'll be thinking, who would this be? Queen Elizabeth's
Great grandmother.
great grandmother.
Okay,
Yes.
got it.
Yeah, great grandmother. Yeah. In 1919, they established a system of local governments that still answered to Britain, but had a lot more autonomy, but still not enough. And they imposed taxes the same way that they did in America. It wasn't a tea tax, it was a salt tax. They began to tax salt in India because salt was so valuable to everything. And at this point, Gandhi actually rose up and encouraged passive resistance. And he was heavily influenced by a lot of that Romanticist writing. He was heavily influenced by Henry David Thoreau, who wrote, a person who is doing the right thing is always in the majority, and that simply by resisting a bad law, you can make it. So his whole thing was passive resistance, just refusing to do what the government needed to do, tearing up their identification cards and things like that. He encouraged his people to go out to the sea and harvest salt water from the sea and refused to pay the taxes on imported salt from Britain. And this non-cooperation movement spread, and it was very, passive resistance, hunger strikes, laying down on the tracks, filling the streets, not violent movement. During World War I, Indian troops worked voluntarily in Britain's military as British troops, in the hopes that their participation in World War I would give them more leverage to negotiate their independence afterwards. But you can see the date here. 1919 is when they imposed the salt tax. World War I happens, and then in 1942 they're still protesting for their independence. So that their participation in World anybody actually watched the movie 1917 after I recommended it? Okay, so you remember there's a scene with a truck, and he gets into the truck and gets to ride for like, I don't know, a mile. And inside the truck is a Sikh soldier who does a really good impression of the very British commander, by the way. Mm-hmm. And that's just an indication of how, intermingled the Indian troops were in World War I. In World War II, they fought because they were still part of Britain and had no choice, but also because the war was actually in that area for a lot of it. So in 1947, Britain is economically thrashed after World War II, and they simply cannot afford to continue to rule India. They just don't have the resources. So Lord Mountbatten, who is the prime minister at the time, negotiates for the independence for India. Do y'all recognize that name, Mountbatten? Are you curious who that is?
Is that again the name?
Mountbatten. There's only one reason I know who it is.
That was Prince Philip's grandfather.
Father, I think. No, grandfather. Yeah, grandfather. No, uncle. It was his uncle.
He was murdered, right?
Mountbatten.
It's Prince Philip.
Prince Philip, who is the 99-year-old prince who just died.
Right, okay.
Right, this was his uncle.
Okay. So he had royalty on both sides.
Oh, this is Victoria's fault. Everybody in Europe, every royal family is related, because she had, I don't know, 38 kids, and they all married, I don't know. So he negotiated the independence of India. The problem was that one of the things that India has is a multitude of different religious beliefs that span the whole subcontinent. And the two biggest ones that can't get along with each other are the Hindu and the Muslim. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things he's worried about is an independent India is who is going to be in charge of this independent India. If we declare them independent, is it the Hindu or the Muslim who are going to be in charge? And so he proposes this idea, which then carries, which is to create a Muslim country of Pakistan, which is here and here. Okay, this is Pakistan and this is East Pakistan. Okay, and then he encourages a massive movement of people into and out of those areas. So all the Hindus should leave those areas and come down into India, and all the Muslims should leave India and go into those areas. And of course they did. They all packed up and they peacefully waved to each other as they drove by. Wow. No, they didn't. There was massive fighting, like massive protests, lots of bloodshed, probably one of the bloodiest. I mean, there were bombings and there were shootings and there was still anger about the fact that the Muslims were expected to leave. And guess what? Today there are still Muslims in India and there are still Hindus in Pakistan, because you can't just shuffle people. That never works in history. So this is one of the most violent relocation efforts. And we have India and we have Pakistan, and we'll talk about kind of what happens with them in the late 70s. But North Korea and South Korea, okay, they were partitioned kind of like Germany. So North Korea had a Soviet influence and South Korea had an Allied influence from the end of World War II. But it's much more strengthened by the fact that in 1948, a leader arose in North Korea, Kim Il-sung, and he was an interesting guy. He claimed to come from legend. He had a birth story that was sort of heroic. Y'all should look into it at some point. He claimed to be the reincarnation of a prince that was born on a mountain. It was it's complicated, but he was actually like born in a Methodist family in a hospital. So none of that was true. But he rose to power and imposed a communist-ish sort of power over his net, but you can't really call it communist because it was also nationalist. He was very much Korea for Koreans, which communists are supposed to be like, let's unite the whole world under one ruler, you know. He was very much, no, he wanted Korea to be sovereign Korean and have control over itself, but with a system of government that looks an awful lot like communism. So he wanted that to be imposed on the entire peninsula, which meant, you know, driving out Allied forces from the southern part of the peninsula. The Allies, especially the Americans, viewed this as a threat by the Soviets. They believed that he had been influenced by the Soviet Union to declare the kind of system that he wanted to declare, and that this was a way of the Soviet Union trying to expand its power. So America parked troops on the southern part of the peninsula, and we had a war-ish. Do we call that a war, Korean War? I guess we do. Yeah, this is a war.
It's still a war.
Yeah, for 5 years they fought and never really moved this line at all. And then they declared a momentary truce, which we're still in, I guess. Right, but the part of the real issue is that we haven't ever really acknowledged Korea as its own country. North Korea specifically as its own country. So this is an interesting indication right here. This is a satellite photo of North Korea and South Korea. Okay, this is the line between North Korea and South Korea. What do you see?
Nothing in the north.
Which means?
They don't have any electricity.
Right, the technology in the north is very, very different from that in the south. What you actually find in the south, interestingly enough, in Seoul especially, is people who have gone to a lot of trouble to study free market economy and like Adam Smith's free market economy and impose it. So actually they have a sort of a cleaner kind of capitalism than America does in some respects. And that's in Seoul, South Korea. But the animosity between these two forces, especially with Japan being sort of allied with the US, and Japan is like right there, is that they constantly feel the need to test their military strength and to display those tests of military strength. So
Yeah, they do that on the DMZ all the time.
yeah, and you know, testing missiles by launching them up into the ocean, basically, is a way of, yes.
Is he kin to the ruler now?
Yeah, he's his grandfather. Which is an important thing to note. The difference between most communist countries and this is that Kim Il-sung passed his rulership to his son, who then passed it to his son. And the idea is whatever else happens, the Kim family needs to stay in charge.
Wow.
Okay, so that's everything else can be sacrificed to that. The regime is what matters.
Well, do the
That was
women
the
have kids?
Hmm?
Do he have kids, the present one?
no, he doesn't, does he?
He doesn't. He has nephews, and personally I'm rooting for his nephew Han Solo.
Yeah.
Because he killed his brother. The current ruler's brother was murdered in an airport a couple of years ago.
They said he was, the brother did it.
They said that his sister was gonna take.
Yeah, he's got a sister who's kind of all up in his business too.
Okay.
But his brother was murdered in an airport. His brother had a son, and that son was whisked away and hidden in Europe.
Gotcha.
And he received a European education. He received an education in France, I think, and a couple of other countries. He's traveled the world. He's very like worldly.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things you don't find in North Korea because they cut off all of the outside influences of the world. I've actually heard that if you like smuggle NCIS episodes into North Korea, they're incredibly popular.
Whoa.
Because in NCIS, they like backtalk their commander, and that's just baffling to the North Koreans. They're like, the way they talk to him, and he just takes it, and they just still work together. It's so weird, you know. So there are things like that. Yeah, because that's the kind of
Same.
thing that North Korea has concentration camps, and yes.
You mentioned that the Russians were intervening, but what about the Chinese? I mean, I know that the 1st Marine Division was surrounded by 20 Chinese divisions, had to fight their way out of the Chosin Reservoir up there at the border. So what's the interrelationship between the Chinese and the Russians?
Well, if you look at this map, This tiny little sliver here of North Korea is what borders with Russia.
Hmm.
This is China. Okay, this is Russia. This is China. Okay, so the influence, but at the time and in the early 50s, China was still sort of getting its feet under it and choosing its own new direction. They were having their own internal distress. And to the Allied powers that be, what this looked like was, if Korea's getting uppity, it must be because Soviet Union's helping them. And the only reason the Soviet Union would be helping them is because the Soviet Union wants to expand communism. China hadn't revealed itself as quite the communist power that it's going to reveal itself by the 1950s when the Korean War actually happened. China was like, we need to keep an eye on that situation. And I guess I do have that in here that we're going to talk about China at some point, depending on how much of this we actually get through. Yeah.
They send deserters back to North Korea.
Yeah, I mean, and they investigated it. They said that their lives were being threatened, and they tried to claim sanctuary. It was complicated. The point is that the Kim regime is the most important thing for North Korea to maintain, and they will do that. So they've proven so far that they'll do that at the sacrifice of their own people. They've let massive people starve to death. They've let massive people die in concentration camps. There is, but you know, the Kim family has to hold power. So anyway, so they've got this one guy out there, Kim Han-sol, who's this young guy who's like gotta be like 23 now, completely Westernly educated. And I just am like, can he come in and be like the legendary returning prince or something and take over and guide North Korea back?
Because
That would be
sister
so cool. Y'all keep an ear out for that name, Kim Han-sol. That's where I'm putting my money. This is gonna get better because he's gonna fix it.
only if sister gets killed.
Okay, that's a small consideration, but I feel like it matters. Don't you think he'd have massive Star Wars support?
Yeah.
I mean, his
People,
life story already.
geeks everywhere would be so happy. Anyway, Vietnam, or French Indochina is what we should call it, because that's what it was after World War II, was also sort of partitioned and divided up. In 1954, there was a conference at Geneva that proposed dividing French Indochina. France is having the same problem Britain is. They can't afford to keep colonies. This was all a French holding. These were French colonies, and they just really can't afford to be colonizers anymore. The war was just too expensive. And so they have to let their colonies go, but they have to let them go in a way that allows them to sort of establish themselves. So they divide up French Indochina into these 3 areas: Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand, actually. They divide up this peninsula into these areas, and immediately they begin to try to figure out exactly what they're going to look like and how they're going to be ruled. In 1954, the Geneva Conference called for free elections for Vietnam, but what had risen up in Vietnam was a powerful communist party. There was a front party for a lot of other people. It was a lot of other parties, but right at the front, the leaders were all communists, including Ho Chi Minh, who was the sort of front runner of everything. He was kind of in charge of everything. So they knew that if they had a free election, that's who they'd vote for. So even though Geneva Convention, which is a alliance of several major countries, had voted to allow free elections, knowing that Ho Chi Minh would probably be the one that was elected, the US said, no, I don't think we're going to do that, and basically imposed a completely different system. The Vietnam was divided into North and South, and the US put forward a leader for South Vietnam that sort of aligned with what they thought would be a good westernized sort of democratic leader. He wasn't actually. He was, this is a complicated thing to cover in one slide, but the leader that the US backed in South Vietnam was very discriminatory against his own people, especially the Buddhists and the non-Christians of his own people. He was a French Catholic Vietnamese person, which there was sort of an elitist class that had risen up during the French colonizing days that was Catholic, French educated, urban, people, and he was one of those, and therefore he had a lot of, prejudice against his country, brothers and sisters living in the country who were Buddhist villagers, not educated, Vietnamese speaking, not French speaking. And so he imposed kind of an elitist class and made kind of a mess out of it, which basically shoved people towards Ho Chi Minh and brought rebellious spirits into all the urban centers. So it made it possible for the communists in North Vietnam, the Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong, to actually recruit from the urban centers in the South, and with the intention of uniting it all under one peninsula. Yes.
Democratic Republic of Vietnam and State of Vietnam,
Mhm.
is that where the war that armed soldiers had to go over and fight in both of those areas?
Our troops went to consult with the forces of South Vietnam and ended up in the battlefields fighting against North Vietnam.
No, I did.
Right, except that most of the fighting actually still takes place down here in South Vietnam.
Gotcha.
And most of the bombing takes place in Laos.
Yeah, we're gonna get to that in a minute. Now, all along this border here is mountainous and forest and jungle and a pathway through which North Vietnamese troops sent supplies to their South Vietnamese rebel partners, and that's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Some of it goes through Vietnam, but an awful lot of it goes through Laos and Cambodia and down to the coastal areas in these countries which we're not at war with. Okay, but it was a major supply artery. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a major supply artery, and the only way to stop supplies from getting down was to bomb the trail, which meant the US dropping massive amounts of bombs in neutral Cambodia and neutral Laos, which I have
They're
here.
still there.
And those
Some
bombs, yeah, those still, they still find bombs, and those bombs still explode today.
Wow.
Like, there's still a total number of deaths every year in Cambodia from exploded ordnance that they're
Laos
finding.
is the most bombed country in Asia.
Yeah, that's right. But basically, we fought. The U.S. fought in Vietnam for between 20 and 25 years, depending on when you start counting. But after 20 years, what they ended up with was a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam, and then the North Vietnam basically taking over the South, and then they end up with just one country, and that's
Hey,
Vietnam.
Mindy,
Yeah.
as a young Marine in Vietnam, I spent most of my time up on right off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I was a forward observer, and
Oh,
I can
yeah.
actually remember finding myself in the middle of an old French minefield. I mean, those people fought like forever, and you were constantly coming across old ordnance like that.
Yeah, we didn't get into the
Yeah, my
U.S.
dad
didn't
did that.
get into Vietnam until there had already been conflicts between the North Vietnamese and the European forces for about 15 years. I mean, we were like, France, you having some trouble over there? And France was like, yes, come and help us. And then the U.S. came and helped them, and France went, okay, y'all got this, we're gonna retreat. And
Yeah, we landed our first Marines there in 1965, right there at Da Nang.
Why? Yeah, Da Nang was where my grandfather served. He was a chaplain. And he died a couple of years ago from complications of Agent Orange, which was a chemical that was sprayed all over the vegetation in order, because jungles make a really easy place to hide. So if you spray something all over the vegetation, it kills the vegetation. But then they found out later that the widespread use of this chemical actually resulted in lifelong chronic illnesses and death. And my grandfather finally succumbed to that.
Face any repercussions that
This is what the repercussions he has faced is right here.
Okay.
This is the evacuation of Saigon. And what you're seeing here is a helicopter on the top of the building, and all of the US people inside the building who worked in that building climbing up into the helicopter desperately trying to escape.
Now, all of them can't fit in that one shop.
No, they can't. There's going to be more choppers, but they're going to be in line.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, but the thing is, the repercussions of the U.S. faced was massive expenditures that were not justified. bruising of the intellect and morals of a whole generation of troops, massive distrust between an entire generation and its government. But the U.S. soil was never hit during this conflict. So
Yeah.
but
Say, Mindy,
our death toll was actually not that high because we didn't actually commit as many troops. The death toll among the South Vietnamese soldiers allied with the U.S. was immense, and the North Vietnamese was even higher. But they had a death or nothing, like we're victory or death attitude about the whole thing.
Those helicopters are the reason why you have a lot of Vietnamese immigrants here that don't know their family, because there are stories of them just taking the children because they want to get the children out and then trying to relocate them in the States.
Actually, we have a professor here
Yeah, I have friends like that.
who was involved in this, that his family were refugees from North Vietnam, if I remember correctly. Is that right? They were refugees into Saigon from North Vietnam, and then he himself was evacuated into America at some point.
His dad was just.
hey, Mindy,
North Vietnamese colonel.
they had
No,
so
he was
many,
a South Vietnamese colonel, and then the North occupied the South, so his family was treated badly because his father was a South Vietnamese colonel. That's right, but then he actually came over to America, and so he's here teaching our campus, like the biology teacher, I think. Yes, Sam.
they had so many helicopters trying to land on the aircraft carriers offshore that they were literally pushing them over the edge. I mean, they had helicopters that the South Vietnamese had, and they were all trying to land on these aircraft carriers. And I've seen pictures of them pushing them off the aircraft carrier to make room.
Yep.
Pushing the choppers out?
Yeah.
Into
Yep.
the chopper?
People panic.
Right into the ocean.
Wow.
So America basically withdrew from South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese took every major urban center. Vietnam was united under communist leadership. It wasn't Ho Chi Minh anymore at that point because he had died, but communist leadership took over. They imposed massive collectivism, and then they took a step back, just like Lenin did, just like Stalin did. They take massive collectivism. Oh no, people are starving. Let's let them make a little bit of money on their own. And so they in 1986, so this was in 1975. In 1986, they imposed a new way, which is socialist communist with some economic opportunity, basically. And this is Ho Chi Minh City today. This is what was Saigon, I guess, but Ho Chi Minh City today.
Isn't that kind of what Russia did? Well, not exactly, but how they said, oh, you can grow and sell.
Yeah, they start with this whole nothing belongs to you, everything belongs to us. And then they're like, you still want food? This is tiresome. Make a little of your own food.
But
And
they're
then
super strict.
make a little of your own stuff. Start your own little business, but we're going to control everything big.
They're super strict about what is brought in, though. My uncle has been arrested a few times.
Okay. Do we want to know what he brought in?
What's he
Well,
bringing in?
He was sneaking in Christian films, and they found out, and they arrested him.
The fallout from this conflict in other countries is a little more takes sort of a different, more substantial.
Oh, we're getting into Cambodia.
Yeah. So what you're seeing here is Cambodian landscape with bomb craters in it. Okay, because that's normal landscape of Cambodia. The U.S. carpet bombed Laos and Cambodia without the knowledge of the people of the U.S. First of all, you should know that this was a military decision that was made at the top level without telling America. And then when America kind of found out what was going on, it sparked protests all over America. So like the Kent University shooting that you hear about is sort of in response to this.
When he went up in the clock tower?
No, there's the protest where the students are like, where that woman is like crouched over a guy who's been shot in this famous photo. I don't
Yeah,
know.
the hippie movement.
Yeah, hippies basically. But
Okay.
the protest was over the fact that we were basically carpet bombing a neutral country that had done us no harm and with whom we weren't at war.
Okay.
What happened as a result of that disastrous treatment is that Cambodia, their basic infrastructure was completely screwed by that whole experience. There was a rising power. There was a King Sihanouk who had basically taken power in 1941. So right at the beginning of World War II, Cambodia had a new king, King Sihanouk, and he was in the middle of revolutionary uprisings all over the place all the time. Like from the beginning, he was trying to figure out how to make peace with his own people because they were constantly rising up in small pockets all over the place. But communist revolutionaries came in. They called themselves the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer are the ancient tribal peoples of French Indochina, and Rouge just means red. So they were the
This is
red.
a bad time in history.
Yeah, and the Khmer Rouge were probably one of the weirdest things about the Khmer Rouge was how young so many of them were. When they marched into Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, and took it over, a lot of the Khmer Rouge soldiers were like 16, 15 years old. They look like an army of children. And the reason for that is because those bombings actually dislocated massive amounts of young people who then wandered the countryside looking for what we're supposed to do now and found themselves being taken in by the Khmer Rouge and indoctrinated and put to work. And one of the things they were put to work doing was when they came into the urban centers was wiping out all of the influence of the West, including education. So like there's stories, anecdotal stories of like the Khmer Rouge checking to see if people had a writing indentation on their fingers. You know, that little callus that you get from writing? Well, if you have that, they shot you. Because
Teachers were shot.
That was evidence of education and
Children were
education
shot.
in the West. Pol Pot, who was the leader of the Khmer Rouge, had this vision of returning Cambodia to that like almost before the agricultural revolution, like take us back to the caveman days, take us back to the days when we were at our absolute simplest, just working the land, no more of this education, no more of any of this. He actually took children away from their families and repositioned them so that they were in communities that, you know, he thought they should be. And I say he, but it was they, the Khmer Rouge leadership. It was this idea that they could create not just the utopia that, you know, Lenin wanted to create, but like something even further back than that, even less of Western ideals. And the way to do that was to basically kill everybody who didn't. So Pol Pot basically presided over 9 million Cambodian deaths of his own people, which is less than 9 million, 3 million.
Oh.
I don't have the number in front of me. Yeah, whatever it was a smaller number than were killed, than have been killed by other genocidal maniacs, but it was a large percentage of the population of Cambodia.
And just to put it into perspective of how recent and how young they were, there are still soldiers that were originally children soldiers who are in their 30s and 40s now working with the military, trying to redeem themselves.
Yeah, the worst.
Only 30 and 40.
The worst of the highest ranking members of this party were put on trial and tried in 1990 for their war crimes during this time. But anyway, how are we doing on time?
Right at 9.
It's right at 9 o'clock? Okay. I tell you what we'll do. We'll move over to South America and then we'll come back to the Middle East and China on Thursday. Let's talk about what's happening in South America. Just checking in with a couple of places. Remember that before World
What is up
War,
with that man's hat?
this absolutely fabulous hat?
Yes.
What's wrong with it?
I don't. The man's got a broken egg on his head.
He must be a general of some sort.
I mean, obviously, he has all the best feathers. Okay, so remember that there was this sort of wave of independence movements that took place in the late 1800s and early 1900s in South America. They kicked off with the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, but then it took them a little while to actually establish governments. And so as we get into World War I, we've still got a lot of European influence in those South American countries because, you know, self-rule is hard, apparently. Military dictatorships, juntas, 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 Military groups of strong people who can afford to buy armies are basically in charge of a lot of these places. Brazil was one of the few places that actually participated in World War II as its own entity. They actually sent soldiers to support the Allies on purpose. And as a result, they were in a pretty good, I'm sorry, a fellow says, sir, your hat is invading my space. Yes, during World War II, they actually participated in maneuvers. They sent troops to Europe. And while they were doing that, authoritarian leaders basically maintained Brazil. So as World War II progressed and as peace was finally declared across all of these boundaries, what was left in Brazil was an authoritarian leader with a military force. But under these authoritarian leaders, they were able to establish economic centers that actually grew. So what you have in Brazil now are governments that are formed with allegiances to those military forces, with those sort of oligarchic forces, but you also have a concerted effort to make Brazil competitive. So that's how they're using their power. Okay. Hey.
Is that when you get like one area where it's extreme poverty and then the area right next to it that's extremely rich?
Yeah, and if you're going to go visit Brazil, this is where you're going to go, right? I mean, you're going to go to one of the pretty parts of Brazil. You're going to go to one of the places that they poured resources into developing. Those
Yeah,
are the
because
places
that was a big controversy during the FIFA World Cup.
Yeah,
Who's from Brazil? Is it J-Lo?
no, that doesn't sound right.
No, she's from the block.
Yeah,
Jenny from the block.
that's Jenny from the block.
Is
Yeah,
it
somebody,
Shakira?
huh?
Is Shakira from?
It's somebody famous from Brazil, she was talking about this pretty part,
Mhm.
but say they never showed
Yeah,
this story part, yeah.
yeah. Now, Nicaragua has had U.S. troops in it since Teddy Roosevelt parked them there. So Teddy Roosevelt parked troops in Nicaragua in like 1909 with an intention of building up the Navy in Central America. That was the whole point of that. All through the 20th century, revolutionary forces keep rising up to try to overthrow the governments that form as a result of that. But they are forming governments out of their own people, but then their revolutionary forces overthrow them and then put their own people in power, and then revolutionary forces overthrow them and put them in their own power. So in the 1960s, communists took over Nicaragua. And this was further evidence that the Soviet Union was definitely spreading, except that it's not actually evidence of that. It's just evidence that the ideas of communism are spreading. And whether or not the Soviet Union is pushing those or not is a subject of much debate. The idea of so anyway, so in the 1960s, communist forces managed to be the revolutionary force that took power. And the US had made an all or nothing policy about containment. So the US supported rebel forces against those communist governmental forces, even though the rebel forces themselves were authoritarian military strongmen. They called them the Contras. Have you all heard of this?
The Contra?
Oh God,
Yeah.
yes. The Contra War.
It's in the We Didn't Start the Fire song. But anyway, that was part of George Kennan's containment theory, although he would not have agreed to this himself, was the idea that whoever is the non-communist is the good guy. So that's who the US is going to support, even though in a lot of cases, whoever was the non-communist was actually also a bad guy because he was a fascist dictator with military strength that he was imposing on the country. So the US covertly assisted rebel movements, funded and sent weapons to the Contras, armed the Contras. And what happened as a result of that was an incredibly unstable governmental system, which is why Nicaragua is still to this day probably one of the poorest countries in South America. But it was part of that whole, well, we have to support the other guys because these guys are communist and communist equals bad. So one more, let's talk about Argentina. The flavor of fascism that moved into Argentina right after World War II. World War II managed to, despite contrary belief, World War II managed to continue to declare itself neutral Argentina did continue to declare itself neutral all through World War II. There was interaction between Argentina and Germany, but there was also interaction between Argentina and Britain. It was a neutral, safe space for both, kind of like Switzerland, until the very, very end, like a month before the end of the war. A month before the end of the war, Argentina declared war against the Axis. So,
Isn't Argentina where all the Nazi officers ended up?
which is funny because they ended up
That was a ploy.
by that time.
in
There
Argentina
were
called
already
like Little
German
Germany.
holdings in Argentina, but part of the reason for that you have to understand was when in the 1840s, when Germany was establishing communities in the Americas, they moved as whole communities. So like they moved into Fredericksburg, Texas, you know, as a whole community and like established whole communities. Some of these communities were in Argentina because they had a good trade relationship with Germany at the time. So it's possible that those Nazi officers who moved into Argentina were moving into like the Fredericksburgs of Argentina.
Yeah, there's an entire city.
Pockets of German culture that already existed there before World War II. So, and it was neutral, so it was safe to move there until a month before the end of the war when they declared war against the Axis. Just to be, you know, on the safe side.
Now, he looks like is it Latino?
Mm-hmm.
But she's like, he might be American.
Well, I think if you dig far enough back in her history, you just find the same thing that you find in a lot of South American countries, which is European influence. You know, but this is Juan Perón.
There's a white Hispanic.
Yeah, I mean, she was played by Madonna in the movie, so I don't know. Evita. Yes, Juan Perón took power in 1943, so in the middle of World War II, he took power, and he imposed a new kind of fascism. He founded what they still call Peronism, and basically what it means is that it's not communism and it's not socialism, but everybody has to contribute to society. So there are quotas for everything in your life. You have quotas for everything that you do. And in this way, every member of society, there's only one class, and that's the working class. And everybody's part of the working class, except in practice, that's not true because there are people who are working at being rich and people who are working really hard and staying poor. But there's only one class, and the only entitled class, the only class entitled to benefits and good treatment is the children. But that's all children across the board, regardless of who their parents are. So what this happens is that it's a fairly strict centralized government. It's fairly strict. It's fascist, so it's like, you know, everything aligns and they control the media and all that kind of stuff. But what happens is Argentina becomes pretty economically stable. Perón and his wife are overthrown, but every election that Argentina has had a Peronist candidate, and Peronist candidates still do very well in Argentina by being sort of like Perón was. So it's still a very popular ideology.
Does it work though? Like,
Argentina is not one of the places from whom refugees are fleeing.
that's fair.
I mean, you know.
Yeah,
I'm
Argentina
looking
is still pretty.
We're not gonna say it doesn't work.
Yeah, we're not going to say it doesn't work. We're going to say it's still a different system, but is it really that different? Think of the children. Anyway, all right, I'm going to stop us there because now we're going to have to go back across the ocean again into Palestine and Israel, and I want to save that for Thursday.
So much.
Yeah, we have a lot of shuffling ground to cover. If you are working on a country and you're like, could we talk about what happens with my country, please? Let me know. But I'm not favoring anybody's country over anybody else's. Like, if you have the country that you're researching, if you're like, but where was Syria? You know, bring it up when we get close, you know, and we'll talk about it. But I'm not picking and choosing. I'm not going over everybody's country right now. I'm not going to hand you, where was your country after World War II? It's a good question to ask. Anybody have any questions? I have an awful lot of chat going on here. Yes, the Giza Strip is complicated. Yes. Jordan's babbling. Okay.
I'm not in the room, so I have to make up for it.
I understand that, and I totally agree that that's a difficult thing for you. Okay, so on Thursday, like I said, we'll go back across the water and we'll take a look at what happens in the Middle East that causes where we are now. But I will say, spoilers, it's because we, you know, thought communism was bad. That's almost everything that happened in the Middle East that has led into the 21st century is because at one point the US thought, but communism is bad. So we have to fight communism, however we do it, including creating Osama bin Laden, which we did.
Yeah, people kind of forget we did that.
Yeah, we kind of forget that he's sort of US's fault. that
Yeah,
they-
America just like decided, hey, we might try war and just never stop.
Well, I kind of think that we've been doing that since the Texas Mexican-American War. I mean, in the Mexican-American War, we basically said, so we're a country that does that.
Yeah.
And then we did it. And we haven't really stopped. But we've learned some lessons, but then some things we keep going back to over and over again. Talking about, we've got like 3 minutes, talking about, for example, Vietnam. America marched troops into Vietnam in the expectation that if they marched troops into a country, they could put down a home rule rebellion in that country. Anybody think of any reason why America of all countries should know that it is impossible to put down a home rule rebellion?
I mean, they're the ones that started guerrilla warfare.
No, they're not. What? That is a
During-
crazy claim, Jordan. What on earth are you talking about? You're gonna need to back that statement up.
Oh yeah, we talked about that in U.S. history, didn't we?
Yes, we did, which is why you have to back it up in here.
Because the tactics were hit them hard and then run away.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's what all home rule rebellions do. They don't have any place to move to. So their choices are either
So we
continue
held
to make trouble and outlast you until you give up on us, or die trying. Whereas for the imposing force, the force that's trying to get rid of the home rule rebellion, that's trying to impose foreign rule, they have to get in, stomp out every single spark of that rebellion and maintain enough troop presence to keep that up for so long that they forget they ever wanted home rule. That's not
For some countries, that's taking out the children.
well, but even in those countries, that doesn't work because you start to do that, and what happens? People rebel. They're like, so this is how you're going to rule us if we don't stop fighting for our own independence? Well, we won't have that, and they rebel even harder. It's not possible to put out a home rule rebellion. The only thing that you can do is negotiate the best possible terms, which I think is what the Geneva Convention was trying to do. Was trying to say we could maintain peace with this country. They could have their election. They could elect their communist guy. He could do his collectivization thing. The country could starve. He could come back around to it, you know, and then he could drop communism again. But they couldn't do that because they thought communism was spreading to the Soviet Union. And then if they let them take this, it's just like letting Hitler take the Sudetenland.
You know, the domino effect.
You can't appease an expansionist empire, and the Soviet Union was the expansionist empire, and now they're making communists in Vietnam. We can't let them have Vietnam. Except it wasn't the Soviet Union that was taking Vietnam, it was communists in Vietnam. So it was based on a couple of really flawed ideas. But we of all people should have known that wasn't gonna work. We of all people should have known they'd rather have massive casualties than allow themselves to lose all hope of home rule. We should have known. Anyway, okay, so we'll talk more about that on Thursday. Anybody got any questions? Everybody doing okay?